Good evening and welcome to another session of the Greek Economic Summit organized by the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce. And this is another of what we call a fireside chat, although it's not actually a fireside, but perhaps we wish it were. The title is very important. It's Trends in Transatlantic Cooperation and Geopolitics in Southeastern Europe. And we have with us physically Bruno Lété, a senior fellow at the Europe Center of the German Marshall Fund of the US in Belgium. And virtually, but in a certain way equally really, he is indeed here, Damir Marusic, a senior fellow at the European Center of the Atlantic Council in the US. We first of all like to thank both of them for being here. And I will start with a question to Bruno Lété. Since tomorrow we're having let's start from the global picture. Since tomorrow we're expecting the phone call between President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. And the question is about the current escalation in regards to Ukraine and whether we're moving towards a more open confrontation there and how this affects the broader geopolitical balances and dynamics, both in Europe in general, but also in particular in Southeastern Europe.
Well, thank you very much for that question, and let me also thank the organizers for adding a geopolitical panel on an economic summit. Without stable geopolitics, you can't have stable economics as well. Coming back to your question, I think right now, obviously, everyone is looking at the eastern flank. Tensions are rising very high. Everyone is being quite nervous on both sides of the Atlantic. And in the end, it's just guessing, actually, what the plans are in the Kremlin. No one can know for sure. Now, having said that, what I observe is that the readiness of the transatlantic partners to really look at the situation. We see that both from Europe and from the United States, there have been very strong signals, political signaling, towards the Kremlin that any intervention in Ukraine would come at a very high cost. But of course, the question is will this actually be enough to convince the Russian President Putin not to do what he might possibly have in mind? We know that Russia has been gambling in the past. Remember Georgia in 2008, there was an invasion there. Remember 2014 in Ukraine. So saying that, there's no clear rationale for Russia to invade Ukraine, that's not the way we should be thinking. We should be thinking about any potential scenario. We should be ready. We should be prepared for any potential future scenario. Now, what warms my heart is to see how much support there is, both from Brussels, Washington, and other EU capitals for Ukraine. Just last week in Stockholm, the American State Secretary has expressed strong support for Ukraine. We see that Europe also is looking at what can be done. So in that respect, I just want to say Kiev is not alone. But, and this is where I finish, I think in Europe we need to understand one thing. What happens in Ukraine potentially will have an effect for the entire European continent. The security of Ukraine is not only the security of Ukraine, it's the security of Europe. So, that's a question that we need to raise for ourselves. Are we just, prepared to let Russia do what Russia might potentially want and pay a cost, or are we saying stop? And I think that's really the question that is now at hand in European geopolitics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but if I may come back on this, do you think that in particular the US is ready to engage in what would be a more open confrontation? Remember that we avoided a direct confrontation between American or NATO forces and Russian and Soviet at that time, Russian forces, even during the previous Cold War. This was a line that was never crossed.
Right.
Although we had the Cold War was a very hot war in other areas of the planet, but not in Europe. Do you think that all the US in the end will attempt to find some kind of compromise balance, or just things remain as they are now?
I think both sides of the Atlantic are now betting on diplomacy. We see that there is diplomatic signaling. We see that right now Europe and the United States are designing packages to make it very costly to the Kremlin to make future interventions. It ranges from, giving weapons to Ukraine, not only of defensive weapons, but also offensive weapons. We also see that there are economic measures that are in the pipeline, measures that go further than today. One obvious measure, for instance, would be to take Russia out of the SWIFT system. That is under control of the West. We also see, for instance, at the level of NATO, what could be happening there. NATO is delivering training, assistance, etc., to Ukraine. But when it comes to the core question that I think you're asking between the lines, I do not see an immediate willingness for the West to be involved militarily in Ukraine. There's two reasons for that. I think, first of all, there's no public support, I think, in Western Europe and perhaps on the other side of the Atlantic, I don't know. There was actually just a poll yesterday in Poland where 60% of the Poles, of the Polish population, said if Russia invades Ukraine, NATO should intervene. So perhaps the public opinion will shift, but then it comes to politics. Ukraine is not a NATO member state, so technically speaking, it does not fall under the Article 5 clause of protection. So the question here is, will NATO intervene as an alliance, or could Ukraine count on the support of bilateral member states? The United Kingdom has already indicated that perhaps it would be willing to send 600-700 troops on the ground. The question is whether the United States and other countries would be willing to do the same.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'm coming to Damir Marusic. 4 years ago, you wrote a report for the Atlantic Council entitled Balkans Forward, a New US Strategy for the Region. And as you know better than me, you made 4 points at that report in regards to US policy. A, establish permanent US military presence in Southeast Europe. B, pursue an historic reapproachment with Serbia. C, regain the United States' reputation as an honest broker. And D, bet on the region's youth and entrepreneurs. Now, 4 years later, what's your assessment regarding to your proposals or on your ideas on US policy in regards to the Balkan? Which of these aspects have moved ahead and where things have not gone so much in that direction?
First, thank you so much for having me. I think this is a really important discussion, and I'm glad we're talking about the Balkans because your questions about Ukraine, I think, directly impact the situation there right now. And basically, I think it would be a mistake to not look at the Balkans as part of a sort of a broader geopolitical contest that's happening right now. Looking back on the report, I think the one part that currently today I would say is incredibly important that we actually, the United States should be doing more is in fact this idea of being an exporter of stability and security. I think if you look at what's happening in Bosnia right now, it's a very complicated situation. The crisis there, not to derail this discussion into the details of that, but it is important to note that a local crisis which has deep roots in the Dayton Accords is in fact being exploited at this point by Russia, among other players, but specifically by Russia. The reality is that I think we're still focused in the Balkans of trying to solve the kind of issues that bedevil it on a very crisis management basis. And we're not taking enough into consideration the extent to which all across Europe's periphery, stability has been waning. And part of that has to do with the fact that we are taking stability for granted far too much. In Bosnia right now, again, Bruno mentioned that the Brits are very strong on Ukraine. They're actually quite strong on Bosnia as well. And I'm hoping that of all European countries, and indeed even more so than Washington, they will take the kind of lead to reestablish order. The big difference in Southeast Europe, as opposed to in Ukraine and the eastern flank, just beyond the countries that are whose security is guaranteed by NATO, we have a situation where events are much more amenable to the kind of strong Western transatlantic policy to actually right the ship than they really are in Ukraine. When you look at the situation in Ukraine right now, as my colleague Bruno just very, very well outlined, there are all sorts of options, including kinetic ones, but the kinetic ones are not very likely to happen at this point. We are talking about deterrence, about sanctions, and about future steps should the Russians choose to do this. The situation is very different in the Balkans. So again, to answer your question, briefly, the report was written at a different time, and various things have shifted in importance. But I do think that this idea, this understanding that the West is a guarantor of ultimate security for the region is important. And I think we really need to get back to that.
Thank you very much. We will return to these questions. Well, Bruno, what's your take on the particular security questions of Southeastern Europe, how it is affected by broader dynamics, what is needed to be done?
You know, I think sometimes it's important to zoom out for a second, right, and look at the bigger picture. And what we see is actually that what we were used to in Europe, the security situation, is completely changing. You know, the rules are changing, the situation is changing, and what makes it so hard is that no one really knows what's coming next. We see old actors that are becoming more assertive, more aggressive. Take Russia. We see new actors coming in, China. We see friends, allies that are trying to go their own path. Think about Turkey. And all these different dynamics make for a very fluid situation. And let's be honest, no one has a clue where Europe will be in 10 years from now. We just know that things are changing right now. And so it's very hard to deal with these changes. And it goes from the Baltics to the Black Sea to the Eastern Mediterranean. It's this arch. We see that NATO is trying to prepare for this. There will be a NATO summit in 2022 in Madrid. NATO is right now rewriting its strategic concept, which is basically a document describing what member states of NATO think are the common threats. We see that the EU is doing the very same thing right now. The EU is going to publish its strategic compass under the French presidency also in March. So we see that both the European Union and NATO are trying to grasp with these changes. The question that needs to be answered, though, is that how do we deal with changes that we are not sure, well, we're not sure what they will be? It's clear that the EU needs to step up military efforts, right? I mean, the EU is a military power, but it's not there where it should be. We need to strengthen the transatlantic relationship. You know, Europe and America need to work together, and with the new administration in Washington, the Biden administration is much more multilateral. There might be a chance to do that. But again, you know, there's changing, the things are changing, the geopolitics of Europe are changing, and the question right now that everyone in each capital is trying to answer is how do we prepare for this?
Yes, thank you. Well, coming to Damir now, I mean, well, in the Balkans, the NATO integration aspect has moved forward. I mean, recently, the solution to the many years long conflict between Greece and Northern Macedonia and the Prespa agreement and the change of and the slight change of name opened up, for example, the way to Northern Macedonia's entrance to NATO. But part of the deal, let's say, towards the Western Balkans, especially the Western Balkans, was also European Union participation, and to that aspect, not much progress has been made. And in a certain way, you can see all kinds of social problems still in the Balkans. Of course, this goes also for countries that are members of the European Union, exemplified in the rather problematic situation in regards to the pandemic in certain Balkan countries. But still, there has been a disappointment from countries like North Macedonia or Albania in regards to, okay, where's our full integration into the West in a certain way, not just the security apparatus, but what about, let's say, common prosperity or growth? Is this a contradiction in the West's approach?
Is it a contradiction? Look, it's a tragedy more than a contradiction. I have to say, the reality of European, of Western policy for the region has always been enlargement. It has been enlargement since 2003 in Thessaloniki, when the promise was made that a European perspective for the region was guaranteed. And it's only this fall at the foreign ministers meeting in Slovenia that enlargement was hotly debated behind closed doors. And the final communique, while mentioning enlargement, refused to mention timelines going forward, anything concrete on this. And this is bad. And you bring up North Macedonia and its current impasse with the Bulgarians. This is not good. And in fact, tragic, as I said at the beginning. I do think it's important to remember that this is a political problem. It's a lack of obviously, it's a lack of progress in a lot of the countries. A lot of reforms still need to be made. But the flip side of it, that there's a lack of political will in many Western European capitals to actually move the ball on enlargement forward. I do think that an interim solution, and you see that the Biden administration is now, pushing for it. And I wouldn't even call it an interim solution, but they maybe call it an interim path forward, is to push for regional economic integration for the region, while at the same time guaranteeing and speaking at every possible moment that the future of the region is in the West, in the broader West. I agree with Bruno. We live in very uncertain times. We don't know what Europe is going to look like in 10 years. But that's no excuse, quite frankly, to not actually keep pushing forward. We cannot be paralyzed, not just in Europe, but here in Washington as well. We have plenty of divisions, plenty of political problems, but we cannot be paralyzed by the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty. We have to keep pushing and moving the ball forward. Specifically on European economic integration, on regional economic integration, whether it's the Berlin process, whether it is these other initiatives on the ground, kind of like Open Balkan, which are started by 3 of the 6 countries. The future of the region, common economic prosperity, as you said it, is, I think, an unavoidable near to midterm goal, no matter where Europe is in the medium to long term. And we really all together need to be pushing for this.
Okay, and final question for both of you, but short answers, please. There is at least one country in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe, where in a certain way it is at stake, and I'm talking about Serbia. In your report back in 2017, you referred to the need for as you called, a historic reapproachment. So what needs to be done in regards to Serbia? So, Bruno?
Well, I would like to get back to what my colleague said. It's all about politics, right? And I would like to underline that the European Union and NATO have engaged with Serbia a lot. Not a little, a lot. The fact is that when it comes to politics, it's all politics, geopolitics, foreign policy. It all starts with domestic agendas. It's all about the political agenda in the capital. And when there are certain political forces in the capital that have a different perception of what should be done, obviously you cannot. The European Union and NATO are not there to enforce things on countries. That's the beauty of the EU and NATO. It respects the sovereignty of countries. Right now, it seems that Serbia has a slight different agenda than the West would be hoping for. I think it's about keep engaging, keep the dialogue going. I think it's about making sure that alignment with the EU and NATO seems attractive, that it brings more benefits than costs. I think that is what we need to show to Serbia. In my humble opinion, the future of Serbia lies in Europe. It's a European country, so we just need to bet on that.
Thank you. Damir?
You know, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I would just say one thing at the same time, and this is, it's exactly about politics. And Bruno, you get it exactly right. We shouldn't at the same time pull back and say that you know, we need to wait for politics to change. I mean, we need to, in fact, this gets back to my original point about the crisis in Bosnia and the ability, I think, our ability to shape outcomes there. The extent to which we are able to shape outcomes in a crisis like Bosnia, and I think do it forcefully, will send a kind of signal which will align political incentives in the medium to long term in all the countries of the region. So if we're sitting here and sort of passively looking at the Balkans as a deteriorating security situation and are unable to do anything about it, I think leadership in Serbia, Mr. Vučić, who I think, quite frankly, you know, without any sort of false pretenses, I think he is one of the cleverest politicians in the region, who actually understands incentives very well and is always looking to play them in the best possible way for himself. This does not mean that we are somehow powerless in front of this and that we cannot adjust these incentives. And I would just put it forward to all of our listeners here that there are many problems in the Balkans, many ways that we can approach it, some constructive, you know, and positive leaning, positive some, and others that we really need to actually reassert a certain kind of order that is badly fraying. And we shouldn't shy away from that. Simply because these problems are difficult, there are some top-level things, especially in Bosnia, that we really should be tackling now, which will, I think, adjust incentives across the region.
Well, thank you, Damir. Thank you both for this really insightful conversation. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but in a certain way, this is a conversation that never ends. And let's hope that despite all the uncertainties, at least the future remains peaceful. Thank you and good night.